try to speed through this part because this is always the part on YouTube that I skip in the debate. So, but thank you everyone for coming. I didn't know how many people to expect. It was a pretty good turnout. So first, I just want to mention that Stanislaus Skeptics, in partnership with the Secular Student Alliance at UC Merced and Sac State, helped put this on to get Dan here and Dr. Russell DiSilvestro. And actually, Stockton area atheists and free thinkers helped out a lot too in helping get this building. So go ahead and introduce our speakers. I'll lay out the format of the debate and then we'll get started. Over here, I have Dr. Russell DiSilvestro. He's an associate professor in the philosophy department over at Sac State, and he's the director of the practical and professional ethics. Okay, honorable. And areas of interest include ethics, metaphysics, and bioethics. Some of the classes he teaches are bioethics, philosophy of law, history of ethics, and political philosophy. He's even written a book, and of course, numerous scholarly articles, but his book's called Human Capacities and Moral Status. So I'm very thankful that he came, heard a lot about him, and so he's awesome. Okay. Yeah. Round of applause for Dr. Russell. Over here, we have Dan Barker. He is a former minister, Christian songwriter, and missionary for 19 years. 19 years. He is currently the co-president, along with Annie Laurie Gaylor, of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is the nation's largest atheist organization. Is that correct? Free Thought, yeah. He's also written a few books, Losing Faith in Faith, Godless, The Good Atheist, and even a children's book called Just Pretend. And they're actually all out there if you want to purchase them later. In case you don't know what FFRF does, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, they fight, keep church and state separate, and they also educate the public about free thought and what it means to be an atheist, I guess. So yeah, those are our speakers. Give it up for Dan Barker. So the way it's going to go is, as soon as I get off stage, we're going to have Dr. DiSilvestro come up, and they'll each get 20 minutes for their opening arguments. And after they do that, they'll come back up, and they'll each have 10 minutes for rebuttal. After the rebuttal, we will take an intermission, so like a 10-minute intermission for bathroom break and whatever else you need to do. Then we'll come back up. They'll each get 15 minutes to just ask their opponent anything they want. And after that, we'll have a 30-minute Q&A. And we'll have this mic turned on. And for anyone that has a question, you can just line up here along the wall. And we're going to ask that you kind of keep it short. We're going to try to get, I don't know how many of you are going to have questions, but that could also get kind of interesting too if people come up and give you their entire philosophy on life. And so I don't want to cut anybody off, but just try to keep it short and make sure to ask a question, not anything else. So I guess that's it. I'll get off stage and I'll let Dr. DiSilvestro do his thing. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Nathan, and thank you to everybody who helped put this on, and thank you to my debate partner tonight, Dan Barker. Imagine your friend told you tonight that you're going to a debate. Actually, imagine you told your friend this, and you told him it's a debate on whether the God of the Bible exists. Your friend asks, oh, well, who's debating? You say, well, one guy's a retired minister, the other guy's a philosophy professor at a state school, and the friend says, oh, well, how predictable is that? The minister's going to say yes, that God exists, and the philosophy professor's going to say no. And then you say, no, don't judge it too soon. And maybe it's not going to be that. And your friend says, well, it's more probable than not. that the ex-minister is going to be taking the affirmative and the philosophy professor is going to be taking the negative. Your friend, you could tell them, come and see. Things in life are often not as predictable as we anticipate them being. The God of the Bible is often presented as not being predictable in the same way. This is a key feature, I think, of his existence. The famous Bible story you may know, the first person says, we found the Messiah, he's Jesus from Nazareth. Second person says, can anything good come from Nazareth? And the first person says, come and see. I'd like to start off with a story from the first century, reported by a physician who happened to be in Athens when something unusual happened out. Jerusalem and Athens met in the person of the Apostle Paul. So here's what Paul had to say after he was in Athens for a while, inspecting a number of the religious symbols and idols that happened to be in the city. He saw what they were up to, and he began to speak to the people in Athens, and including a number of philosophers. Paul stood up and said, men of Athens, he's talking to some Epicurean philosophers and Stoic philosophers. He says, I see that in every way you're very religious, for as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Now what you worship is something unknown I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him, and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. Paul here touches on a number of different ideas when he's appealing to an audience that doesn't share all of his religious presuppositions and backgrounds. And I'm going to try to echo some of the things that Paul said in Athens to the people attending this debate tonight. I'd like to sketch a couple arguments that people have found persuasive for the reality of God, and in particular, the reality of the God of the Bible. This is not going to draw on many things that are original. You can find sketches of the kinds of things I'm presenting in a recent book by University of Southern California philosophy professor Dallas Willard. He got a book just a few years ago called Knowing Christ Today. You can find summaries of some of these arguments in chapters 4, 5, and 6. When we talk about the God of the Bible, we're often thinking of something that's the creator of the physical universe, something that's itself non-physical, something that's got the powerful ability to cause the physical universe and has the ability to choose or will, the ability to think as well, and also the ability to love and act in the universe that has been created. Now, people have often found the existence of the physical universe itself persuasive or indicative of the reality of a God. This comes not only from biblical sources, but from ancient Greek philosophers as diverse as Plato and Aristotle and Epictetus. But one of the arguments for the reality of something spiritual, something at least minimally non-physical outside of the physical universe, takes as its cue either contemporary things from scientific discoveries or just philosophical reflection about the nature of the visible world. So contemporary scientific theories about the origin of the universe often say very strongly that the universe had a beginning at some point in the past. And so the obvious question is, what caused the universe to begin then? And you could say, well, it just popped into being. But the alternative is that something caused it to come into being. And since we don't normally think of things popping into being like this pen or a cup of Starbucks coffee or this auditorium, we don't have experience of things just popping into being. It makes a lot more sense to us that something caused the beginning of the universe. Now, even if you didn't have the evidence of cosmology trying to say, look, the astronomical evidence indicates that the universe has a beginning in the past, you can just think philosophically about this and realize that the series of past events, like a series of dominoes stretching off in a certain direction, needs to have a first domino to fall if you're going to have dominoes falling where you're standing. In other words, unless the past was finite, then we would never have reached the present moment. So these are typical arguments that are sometimes brought under the banner of cosmological arguments for the reality of something spiritual, something at least minimally non-physical that caused the physical universe to begin. Now, if you followed this particular path of thinking this far, you'll also probably notice that when you think about why something non-physical would cause the physical universe to come into being, it makes sense to interpret that causation as coming from a choice, as coming from a decision, a will of some sort, discriminating between one state of affairs and another. Otherwise, you would just have a eternal spiritual being kind of stuck without creating the physical universe. Now, why would such a being choose one thing over the other? This is where a lot of people often bring in the idea that this spiritual being would have the capacity to think, because the capacity to think is what, in our experience, helps us to make something just possible into something actual. It's what we use to guide our choices. The reason why I picked this pen up rather than let it just stay on the table is because I thought about it and I chose to do so based upon my thinking. Now, when thinking about the capacity of a spiritual being to think and bring the universe into existence, not only you're going to imagine this to be something very powerful, after all, the amount of power that it requires to bring the physical universe into being is much greater than the amount of power it requires just to lift this pen. You also have the ability to think about whether the order within the physical universe, the intelligent arrangement of things, or just the information present within the universe, whether it's the fact that these chairs are in a row or the fact that the podiums are set up in a certain way, whether the order in the universe owes its existence to something beyond the universe or not. Now, the idea that the universe itself has something that designed it in an ordered way is something that has appealed to people who have investigated the various kinds of order in the universe ever since science began with ancient Greek philosophers. So whether you're looking at the intricacies of biology, whether you like the human eye as your token example, as some people do, or whether you're looking at the examples from chemistry or astronomy or physics, really pick your science, and you've got a remarkable cluster of facts and laws that are more and more becoming discoverable by the investigations that we're doing. And this order, this order is real, and this order is explainable by a source that is itself intelligent. Now, if you follow the argument up to this point, you don't have the God just of the Bible. You have the God of any kind of deist, of any kind of religious tradition that involves a creator. And indeed, this is where some people stop when they make the migration from an atheist or agnostic position to something theistic, as in the case of the recent philosopher who had a semi-conversion, or at least a transition, A.J. Ayer. He didn't go all the way to the God of the Bible. He went to a more deistic, watchmaker that kind of starts off the universe in an ordered way. But I think we can go beyond this. And I'm impressed by the arguments I've seen by Tim and Lydia McGrew, by William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne, by Gary Habermas, and a number of other scholars who try to give an argument for the reality of God's intervention in history through the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. This, of course, echoes what Paul said to the Athenians. Paul himself is one of the exhibits in this overall proof. The argument with Paul is, what would cause a person like this, who is very much against the Christian message, to suddenly flip-flop and change his mind and begin preaching the very thing he used to be persecuting? Paul himself gave his own testimony as, I saw Jesus raised from the dead, and that's why I changed my mind. Now, an example from Gary Habermas was printed up recently in the Washington Post on March 31st, where he gives a couple lines of evidence to prove the reality of the resurrection, even apart from those who think of the Bible as inspired or authoritative in any way. The ones that William Lane Craig typically brings forth have four different data points that try to be explained, and thinking through what's the best explanation of these data points if you accept them. The first data point is that after Jesus' crucifixion, he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. Second data point is on the Sunday that follows the crucifixion, Jesus has a tomb that is found empty by a group of his women followers. Third data point, on multiple occasions and under different circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. And then the fourth data point is that the original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite their having every reason not to. Now, different rival theories of these data points often fail to adequately explain them. So, for example, you may have heard of the hallucination theory, or the wrong tomb theory, or the conspiracy theory, or the apparent death theory. But these different alternative theories, I think we can see, have some flaws in them. Now, even if you've got the resurrection, and the idea would be the best explanation of these data points would be God raising Jesus from the dead, rather than just sort of a spontaneous resurrection. Okay, so that's how you get from these data points and a resurrection to the God of the Bible, is that God's necessary to explain such an unusual event. It still raises questions about, well, what's God doing today? And here, I'd like to say that I think that the argument from religious experience has a lot to offer. Paul, of course, said that God is not far from each one of us. And I think that most of us have run into people where we've heard miracle reports, either from our own circle of friends or family. And of course, these miracle reports have different levels of credibility to them. But the contents of these miracle reports are sometimes relevantly similar to the contents of miracle reports of the earliest Christians that we find in the library of resources referred to as the New Testament. And oftentimes the distance between us and the event that these miracle reports have is relevantly similar to the distance between various stages of the earliest Christian documents, whether it's the oral tradition, the written stuff, the copying of stuff, or whatever. And so I don't think there's any reason in principle to reject the miracle reports of the New Testament, whether they be resurrection or something else. Now, of course, the New Testament has a lot more miracle reports than just resurrection. It has stuff going on with angels, stuff going on with demons, stuff going on with healing people. Now, I think that these are the sorts of things that modern people can take seriously. So I here cast my vote with what C.S. Lewis used to call, Christianity in its mere form, M-E-R-E. And I cast my vote against what he sometimes called Christianity in water, which is the idea that all you need to believe in is some sort of a good God up in heaven who wants us to behave well, right? And leaving out all the stuff about angels, demons, healing, and so forth. Now, I've got various examples of this sort of thing that I can talk about in the question and answer time if you want to, but let me just give one or two of them here. Thomas Morris wrote a book with a number of others a few years ago called God and the Philosophers. Thomas Morris was a philosophy professor at the University of Notre Dame. He's still alive, although he's doing the Morris Institute for Human Values in North Carolina. And he writes in his entry on this book that the more I probe, the better a religious picture of the world looks to me, however subtle some of its strengths might be. But it was no amount of philosophical reasoning that originally gave me this picture of the world. I had long had a suspicion that there is much, much more to reality that meets the eye. After talking about some of his own personal experiences and his family experiences, Morris points out that one professor I got to know very well at Yale once told me that he was an atheist and that he did not accept the reality of anything like a soul or a spirit in the human domain. But one thing really worried him. Enter a room full of intelligent and sincere people. Loosen them up a bit so that they are comfortable talking about personal matters. And you'll often hear some strange stories along these very lines, stories that it's terribly hard to make sense of, apart from something like a religious view of the world. My old high school friend, when he visited from Harvard, brought back stories from the Harvard Radcliffe Christian Fellowship that made me listen transfixed. Stories about penetrating prophecies, speaking in tongues, and healing miracles that he claimed to have witnessed firsthand, such as a grotesquely broken bone being restored instantly in the midst of a pickup football game in response to group prayer. What do you do when people you respect, admire, and otherwise completely trust tell tall tales such as these? You begin to be suspicious, despite any inclinations you may have to the contrary, that there may indeed be a great deal more to life than meets the eye. Let me give you one example of this from a contemporary philosopher who I know personally, named James Porter Moreland. Moreland had this happen to him, and I'll close with this story. He says, on a weekend in October 2004, I flew to Seattle to speak at a weekend retreat for a traditional, non-charismatic Bible church. After my second talk, a woman approached me somewhat sheepishly and asked to speak with me in private. I agreed, and with some hesitation, she said that for about half an hour during my talk, she had clearly seen 3 angels guarding me as I spoke. One angel was on each side, and a taller one was behind me, looking over my head at the audience. When she left, I asked 4 or 5 people, including the pastor, to tell me about the woman, and to a person, they still said that she was probably the most mature woman in the congregation. Still, I was skeptical of her claim, but I retained her testimony in my heart. Now fast forward to September 2005. While I lay praying on my bed one night, as I pondered some deep burdens in my heart, I said something to the Lord I had never prayed in my life. I asked him to do 2 things. Send the 3 angels back to protect me during this intense period of special burdens. I told God that since I do not see such things, for all I knew they were already around me. But just in case, I asked God to send them back. And somehow, please let me know that they are there. I continued praying for about another 20 minutes and then drifted off to sleep. I was about to experience the shock of my life. Less than a week later, I received an email, which I kept, from a philosophy graduate student named Mark, who was taking a class with me that semester in metaphysics. Mark began by saying that he wanted to share with me something for a few days, but he had to process it with other students first. It turns out that a few days earlier, during one of my lectures, Mark had seen 3 angels standing in the room, one on each side, a taller one behind me, for 5 to 10 minutes before they disappeared. I asked Mark to come to my office, and a few days later we talked. Because he respected me as his professor, he began by telling me that he didn't want to say anything to me he wasn't sure of, and he knew that the angels were next to me in the room and not in his head. The story goes on, but I think you get the point. The probability of this sort of thing happening is remarkably low, unless, of course, the God of the Bible is real.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Stanislaw Skeptics, is that what it's called? And the Secular Student Alliance for hosting this event here in Turlock. This is my first visit to Turlock. This is your first? There you go. There's a first for everything. What is the probability of that? Both of us would never have been to Turlock before. On a Friday. By the way, today's Friday, right? You know what Friday means?
No.
What does the word Friday mean?
Frigid.
Close. There was a Norse goddess named Frigg, F-R-I-G-G. She was married to Odin. She was married to Wednesday. Friday was married to Wednesday, and I guess Thursday came between them. Thor was actually a Thursday, and Thor was the god of thunder, who was, I guess, like a stepson to Frigg. Frigg was this goddess that millions of people believed in. Are there any people in this audience tonight who still believe in the existence of Frigg? We have a day named after her. Anybody? Why don't you? Why don't you believe in Frigg? We have a day. There's always one in every crowd that does that.
Zeus.
Zeus? Okay, Zeus was the Greek counterpart to Thor, the god of thunder. But nobody believes in that god anymore. Does anyone believe in Zeus in this audience? The god of the Greek myths? No? And no Thor, no Zeus. What about Diana? Let's come over to the Americas. How about Ixtaccíhuatl? Anybody believe in that god? No? No? How about Yamraj? Any Hindus here? No? Anybody here believe in the god? There was a god, in a Bronze Age god in the Middle East named Yahweh. Yahweh was a war god who told us what his name is. He said, "My name is jealous." Yahweh liked to exterminate entire tribes of people who did not bow down to his authority. Anybody in this audience believe in the existence of Yahweh, the God of the Hebrew Scriptures? There should be some. Well, usually there's some in every audience that say, yes, I believe in the God of the Bible. And what I say to them is that, well, then the only difference between you and me is that I believe in one less God than you do. You've thrown all these gods in the trash heap of history. And they served their time when there were gaps in our understanding. When people heard the thunder and they saw the lightning, they thought, what is that? What could it be? It must be some agency. It must be because it's natural, isn't it? Isn't it more probable when you're thinking about probabilities and natural things that if you hear these things up there and they're making noises, there must be some agent, some creative intelligence behind it? Doesn't that seem natural to you? To give it a name, let's call it Thor, or let's call it Zeus. But now we know something about weather. Now we know something about electricity. And that gap in the understanding of the ancients has closed. And now we no longer need those deities. We no longer need those gods, and they have been retired, although we still have days of the week named after them. There is no Yahweh Day in the United States, is there? Or no Jesus Day, at least in the U.S. I think some countries might have what do they say in Russia? Voskresenia, right? A resurrection day. So there are some countries that have, the Christian deity within it. But gods existed to explain things. And Russell is right. There are some unanswered questions. And he's quite right to point out that cosmologists are still struggling with a lot of things. No more with what's the light in the sky and the noises in the sky, but things like early cosmology. How did that happen? By the way, we do know that things do pop spontaneously into existence from nothing. We know that from science. We know that's happening all the time. It's happening right before your nose. Quantum potential, where there's an absolute vacuum of outer space, where there's no matter at all. There's a frothing creation of particles and antiparticles that immediately cancel each other out. Occasionally, if one of them gets separated, and it's a rare case, but it could happen near the event horizon of a black hole. Occasionally, if one of those gets pulled into the black hole and the other one doesn't, voila, you have something from nothing. We do have an experience of out of a vacuum, actual matter or antimatter being created. But the God of the Bible is just an idea. It's just something that some people thought was true, and I think Russell agrees with me that in the Bible there is a lot of metaphor. When Jesus said, I am the door, you don't look for hinges. We all know that, right? He's the Lamb of God. We don't shear his wool. I mean, we know that the Bible has a lot of metaphor. Jesus even made up stories. He made up parables. Nobody thinks the prodigal son actually existed. It doesn't even have a name. It was a story that was made up to teach a moral truth. And now most people are convinced that Adam and Eve didn't really exist because they were, there couldn't have been. Now from what we know about the fact of evolution, there could not have been an Adam and Eve. So the early Israelites made up that story as a kind of metaphorical explanation. And it didn't matter if it was true. It was the moral tale that they were trying to teach. So we know the Bible has a lot of that in it. Made up stories, parables, metaphors, and things. And I used to believe all that when I was a Christian minister, when I preached for years, believing that Christ was coming soon. And I would read the Bible and I would think, wow, prodigal son and Adam and Eve and all that stuff. But then it dawned on me, well, if there's metaphor in there, where do you draw the line? How do you know if God himself, how do you know that Yahweh itself is not also one huge metaphor? Who makes the decision where you draw that line? And of course it was. It was a story just like the Aztecs and the Mayans and the ancient Hindus and the Buddhists. They all came up with their own idea. My Native American tribe that was on this continent 15,000 years ago, ancestors were on here, which, by the way, was 9,000 years before the earth was created, if you think about it. In my tribe, the Lenape tribe, we're called the Delaware Indians, it was a turtle out of this endless water, and this turtle, with no name, swam down to the bottom and brought up some mud, and the mud came up, and then the mud dried in the sun and became the continents, and it grew, and then there was a blood clot, and the rabbit came by, and the rabbit kicked the blood clot, and it turned into a human, and that's the story. I think it's a cute story. I remember my granddad telling stories like that, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I love hearing those stories. But there really wasn't a turtle and a rabbit. And besides, where did the turtle and the rabbit come from? It's the same question of his intelligent designer. Okay, so you got nothing, but where did this designer come from? I mean, if you could just posit some intelligent creature out of nothing, contradicting the claim, by the way, that nothing comes from nothing, well, then why couldn't my ancestors have just posited some ancient turtle, right? And I think all of us in this room realize those were stories. They were stories to plug the gap. Atheism is a lack of belief in a God, and my lack of belief in a God now stems from a number of lacks. A lack, in the first place, of a coherent definition of what we're even talking about with a God. If we're going to argue for the existence of something, then let's define it. Let's give it a definition that has some kind of a sense. The only way you can really define something, if it exists in reality, is to measure it. What is a spirit? If God is a spirit, the Bible says, and they who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. What does that word spirit mean? What does it mean? How big is it? How much does it weigh? How much space does it take up? How does light refract off of it? Or what? If something exists, you can measure it in some kind of a way. How fast is it going or what? But to see these angels, spiritual angels, stand beside somebody on a stage that are basically the same size as a human being. Angels must have evolved on an Earth-like planet that had bodies about the size that gravity would make the bodies that we have. How would a spirit be that shape if it were a thing? Obviously, what these people were seeing was a concept or a hallucination or an image or a dream. Or the human mind is very, very creative with these things. I've had dreams that I thought were real, but I didn't think a boogeyman was actually crawling through the window. But when I woke up, we all have creative brains that can do that. What is more probable? That there actually are these immaterial beings floating or walking, human-shaped, that light can bounce off of so you can see them, so they must have some physical properties, that they actually exist, or that the human mind is doing some kind of creative thing. Human minds are very creative, I think you have to agree, because of your experience from the reports of other religions. When the Hindus die and they go up to heaven, and some of them have these near-death experiences, and they see Yamraj sitting up at this big desk with a ledger, and Yamraj, the Hindu god, is filling out and going, oh, there is a mistake here. There was a clerical error. You must go back. You hear those reports. They're seeing their Hindu god. People who believe in Christian angels will see, I don't know how you would know it was an angel in the first place. How would you even know that? Did it have wings? Did it have a sign to angel? How would you know you were even looking at an angel? Obviously, it's some kind of a preconception in the mind of the person who thinks they're seeing angels. We don't have a coherent definition of this being that we're even arguing for. We can't measure it. We can't define it in positive terms. Usually it's defined in negative terms. the non-corporeal essence, the intangible being. But no one has ever actually positively defined what a spirit is, or how the word spirit differs from nothing at all, or from concept. Beyond that, also, I've never heard a theist define their God in such a way that it could be testable or falsifiable. In order for any statement to be true, any statement, there must be other statements which can be said, which, if true, would make this statement false. For example, all polar bears are white. Here's the statement that says, I found a black polar bear. If that statement were true, it would falsify this statement. I've never heard a theist produce an example of a statement which, if true, would falsify their claim. And in order for any statement to be true, it must be in principle, not necessarily in actuality, but it must be in principle falsifiable. There must be other things that can be said which would make it true. Falsifiability doesn't mean it's disproved, it means that it is vulnerable to testing. There's also a lack of evidence. There is no actual evidence for a God. And by the way, the resurrection story is not evidence for a God. I want to talk about that during rebuttal because it's a juicy topic. And I'll show why Russell is wrong, and by Habermas and Craig especially is very wrong to even offer the resurrection as some kind of data points to prove the existence of an immaterial personality out in the universe. But if there were a God, there'd be some kind of evidence, wouldn't there? If there were, that would change everything. By now, somebody should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing out the existence of some hitherto unknown force in the cosmos that we can actually see as real evidence. Just because you have a word for something doesn't mean you actually have a thing. Just because you have a word for God and a concept for it doesn't mean it's an actual thing in reality. Science, for example, in the 1800s, had a hypothesis of the ether. We all know about that. Since light was determined to have wave-like properties, then there must have been something waving, so there had to be some tenuous ether in the cosmos. Brilliant scientists, they were convinced that the ether was a real thing, but they waited for confirmation. They didn't just say it must be true because it's more probable or more likely. Then along came Einstein and found a way to test, and did an actual test through observation which disproved the existence of the ether. We now know that that hypothesis has been falsified. It has been disproved. We still have the word ethereal, which means what? Like non-existent, right? We have the word spiritual too, which means what? May as well mean non-existent as well. These arguments, and Russell brought up at least two. I don't think you mentioned ontological, but you did mention Swinburne. And Swinburne and I did debate once in Dublin, Ireland, and he brought up his version of an ontological. And Bertrand Russell basically looking at these cosmological, teleological, as he referred to, design arguments, ontological, and some of the others. Bertrand Russell basically said, you know what, it all just boils down to bad grammar. They're words. Words. Think about it philosophically. Even Bertrand Russell himself admitted when he was a young man that he was momentarily persuaded by one version of the ontological argument, by Anselm's version, that proves there's a God. It's like pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. But then the next day he realized, bad grammar. Sorry, my bad. And they do look seductive. Some of these arguments, when you lay them out on paper, but what they basically boil down to, and I think Russell hinted at it, maybe not, they basically boil down to what we call God of the gap. We don't have an explanation for this. How do you explain that? Therefore, God. Did you notice that Russell in his opening statement even used the word evidence from cosmology as if this were evidence for a God? When what we're really looking at is not so much evidence for, we're looking at a lack of evidence for, and then using that lack of evidence, that gap, that open question. And it's good for science to have open questions because that's what drives science. If there were no open questions, science would be dead. It's great that we don't know a lot of these answers yet. But it is irresponsible to just plug that gap with your particular God of choice, the God that you happen to be born into in the country, in the culture that you happen to be born into, that taught to you as a child. So during rebuttal, I'll talk a little bit about the God of the gaps. Another lack that we have when it comes to this question of a God is a lack of agreement among people who claim to believe in this God. Even people who read the same Bible don't agree with each other about the nature of this God or its moral principles even. Didn't Paul write in the New Testament, God is not the author of confusion? But can you think of a book that's caused more confusion than the Bible? They disagree with each other. They fight with each other. I was just talking with an old missionary friend today, Gary, who was evangelical Christian, Bible born-again Christian, and he's had a transformation in his own thoughts. He's now a universalist. He still believes in God and Jesus and all that, but he's changed his opinion about the nature of this biblical God. There is no coherent agreement or nature of this being within the Scriptures. You find a God who says this and who does this. He's a God of love. He's a God of war. He's a God of killing. He's a God of hatred. I have hated them with a perfect hatred, the Bible says. And a God of contradictions, a God of insecurities, a God who has such a big ego, such a big vanity that you have to have a whole day of the week set aside to worship Him. And if you don't, you're going to have to die, and the earth is going to be scorched because it doesn't give Him His proper respect and holiness. You find all sorts of different gods, and you don't find agreement among believers about what this being is they're even arguing for. Russell, to his credit, did say you can argue to a certain point to kind of generic God, and then from there on, I guess Christians pick the one that fits what you like, I suppose. And the Bible tends to be a kind of grab bag of what you think the being is. And then, of course, there's no good reply to the problem of evil. There is none. There are a number of theodicies that apologists have tried to come up with. Hicks's soul-building theodicy, which I think is one of the most attractive ones, is that we have evil so that our characters can grow and build. But basically, if God is defined as a good being, and Russell didn't go so far as to say that God is defined as good, but I assume as a Christian he thinks God is good, then how do you explain the problem of evil? And not just moral evil, but natural evil as well. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital, and you know there's no God. Those people who pray don't have any better success. You don't have any real documentation of miracles. If miracles really happen, like Russell suggests, that would revolutionize medicine. It would change everything. If you could take the Bible literally, like the parents of little Kara Newman did up in northern Wisconsin a couple years ago, and it says in James, the prayer of faith will heal the sick, and they will rise, and then you anoint their head with oil. So they believed that. They prayed for her. They brought in a minister to pray for her, and she died a horrible death from easily treatable diabetes on Easter morning because they believed that the God of the Bible was telling the truth. I'm sure Russell doesn't go as far as those people, but that came out of that same book that he pretends to believe presents to him the God of the Bible. And actually, there's no need for a belief in a God. Yes, there are gaps, but what's the big deal? What difference does it make whether somebody believes in a God or not? I mean, you're welcome to. It's a free country and a free society. But millions of people on this planet, millions of people on this continent live full, happy, productive, meaningful lives. Lives of joy, lives of family, society, culture, beauty, without such a belief. A belief is a belief. That's all it is. A belief in a God might make you feel something, special or chosen or like you have a place in this world, but millions of us get through life just fine without such a belief. I'm going to talk just a little bit during the rebuttal about the resurrection, but I want to point out that the Bible is not a reliable book to base any conclusion on. It has some truth in it. It actually has some good teachings in it. The Bible is written by a whole bunch of different people over a whole bunch of period of time that contradict each other. It contradicts science. There are cases where if you want to be healed, you just look at a snake on a stick. There's a talking snake in the Bible. And we know that snakes don't have vocal cords. There's a talking donkey in the Bible. There's a seven-headed dragon whose tail is so big that it blots out a third of the stars of the sky. There's food falling from the sky. There's historical mistakes. There are historical anachronisms within the Bible. There are footprints of borrowing from pagan religions. There are actual almost cut-and-paste footprints from some of the Greek, from Homer himself put into the book of Mark. We see all the manufacturing of it, just like people today are making up modern religions. Look at the Mormonism and the Scientology and these things. They were making up religions back then, and you can see the craftsmanship of it. You can see the footprints of legend within the book. So before we use the Bible as any sort of evidence, we're going to have to make a case for the reliability of the Bible itself. And when you look at it critically, the Bible falls apart. There's a couple of good teachings in there, of course. That would be a true miracle if there were no good teachings in the Bible. But on balance, it's not a book that inspires any confidence in its material claims, factual claims, or especially in its moral claims. So based on all of those lacks of evidences and all those lacks, I have no choice but to conclude that not only does the God of the Bible not exist, but no God. It's much more probable that the natural universe exists without some kind of a supernatural oversight.
At this point, I think I have 10 minutes, is that right?
Yeah.
To give a rebuttal of sorts. And what I'd like to do is to focus on a couple of the points that I was making, as well as a couple of the points that Dan Barker was making. I think that it's quite true that there were different gods that people believed in Bible times as well as now. And I liked his argument, actually, about how he believes in just one less God than I do. Something similar happened to Paul, not in Athens, but in Ephesus. Because in Ephesus, the people who were worshiping the goddess Diana were making a lot of money on some idols, and Paul's preaching of Jesus was bad for their business. And so they got together and had a meeting and said, this Paul, he teaches that man-made gods are no gods at all. And we've got to get rid of this guy, Paul, before he ends up defaming our dear goddess Diana. So they stirred up a riot and caused some trouble. Now, the fact that there are different gods that people believe in, I think is a problem of how to understand the relationship between the God of the Bible and these other alleged gods. And here I think the options are many. You could say there are actually multiple gods. That's not a common one that people take. You could say that there is the God of the Bible, and that God sometimes appears under different forms to different people in different cultures. That's somewhat more popular than the first. A third solution of many would be that the God of the Bible is real, and these other gods are not real at all. Like they're complete naturalistic figments or hallucinations. That I think is, you find that sometimes, but there's an alternative to that as well. Let me give you a fourth one, and that is that this God of the Bible is real, but these other gods are other spiritual beings, whether they be angels or whether they be demons, and these other spiritual beings sometimes get worshipped as if they are gods. Now, it's possible that you can take from a lot of these different alternative explanations, but I don't think any of them require you to deny the reality of the God of the Bible. Of course, his solution is to just say a pox on all your houses, to all of the different world religions and all of their gods. Let me return to his claim that the definition of something spiritual has never been given. This is a task that's not impossible to meet. One common definition of the spiritual that I've heard is that it's personal power that is not embodied, or personal power that is non-bodily. So, for example, imagine two different people arguing about how the universe came to be. One of them says, first, there was nothing. Then, there was the physical universe. Okay, another person says, wait a minute. First, there was a personal power that was non-bodily, and that person created the universe. There is a difference here. They are arguing against each other about something real. I believe that one of the claims that struck me from Dan's presentation was that unless something is falsifiable, then we cannot believe it to be true. Falsifiability has been an attractive test at different periods in the history of philosophy, but unfortunately, it's no longer recognized as being necessary for something to be true. One of the simplest reasons for this is that the statement itself, that in order for any statement to be true, it must be falsifiable, is not a falsifiable statement. And the people who were initially attracted to falsifiability as a necessary criterion for truth eventually recognized that, and they tried to patch it in various ways, but I believe the consensus within the broad community of those who do philosophy these days is that falsifiability is not necessary for something to be true. Neither is its twin brother, verifiability. Some people say, well, maybe you don't have to falsify it, you just have to verify it. Something can't be true unless you can verify it. Faces similar problems. Now, let me also say, I believe that there is a way to verify whether the God of the Bible is real, even apart from the philosophical arguments. And let me give you a couple more examples that I believe lend credence to this. The Bible itself often says things like, taste and see that the Lord is good, seek and you will find. And I don't think that it's wise to interpret these as sort of like, how should I put this, promises which are like 100% money back guarantee, like if you do this today, you'll get what you want. But let me read you a range of different ways of approaching this experimentally. One philosopher from that book, God and the Philosophers, who I really like, is named Peter Van Inwagen. Van Inwagen tells a story about when he used to be an atheist before becoming a Christian, and I think it's one that a lot of us can resonate with, because it didn't turn out in the typical happy Christian way. Van Inwagen says, one day in the late 1960s, I fell to my knees and I prayed for faith, but faith did not come. I do not know what led me to make this gesture, but presumably there must have been some sort of felt pressure, and presumably this pressure did not long continue. I expect that I had been setting God some sort of test. If you don't give me faith on the spot, I'll conclude that you do not exist, or are not interested in me, and that these pressures I've been feeling have some sort of purely natural explanation and can be ignored till they go away. We all know how well that sort of thing works. Now, Van Inwagen, I think, is onto something here. Oftentimes, these ultimatums don't work. They don't produce diddly squat. But there are people who try this sort of thing and get different results. Let me give you Gary Habermas, the person I referred to earlier, who wrote that Washington Post article about the resurrection. He talks about his days as a skeptic, and something interesting happens in his case. He says, I remember back in my days when I was searching, I was arguing with Christians, and I'd say, if Jesus appeared to Pilate, that would really be neat. Of course, Jesus did appear to James, the brother of Jesus. That's a family skeptic versus an outsider. That's two skeptics who convert, right? James and then Paul he was talking about. But, says Habermas, I remember having a skeptical episode where I looked out behind my house. There was this large tree, and I remember thinking to myself, if God really existed, he could knock that tree down. And I stood, and I stared at it, and I said, I thought so. Then I turned and walked away. Guess what? That night, there was a storm, and that tree was knocked down, and only that tree. For a few years, I walked by that tree every day, and it never, ever touched my skepticism. So I'm wondering, would that really have done it? Now you might think, well, look, if you were to die and then see like a light that you knew was responsible for the government of the universe, then maybe you would say, okay, fine, I bend, I believe that there's a God. There's an atheist philosopher named A.J. Ayer who had a near-death experience, and he wrote about it. According to his attendants at the hospital, Ayer's heart was stopped for 4 minutes after an episode of choking. Ayer tells of 3 unusual experiences that occurred to him during this time, but the third one he remembers very clearly. He says, "The only memory that I have of an experience closely encompassing my death is very vivid. I was confronted by a red light, exceedingly bright, and also very painful even when I turned away from it. I was aware that this light was responsible for the government of the universe." Now, interestingly, Ayer, when he comes back from this, ends up explaining this away as brain tricks. It wasn't really like God confronting me. It was my brain playing tricks on me. Now, my point is not whether or not Ayer really did see God. My point is that, by his own account, he felt like he was confronted by a light that was responsible for the government of the universe, and yet that, to him, wasn't enough. I could read more stories that deal with things from other cultural traditions where people tried to reach out on their own to see what they could learn about God, and had responses that to them seemed very much improbable, whether they be of a visual form, where you're actually seeing Jesus even though you're from a Hindu background, or whether they're from a circumstantial form, where you go up on a mountainside and call out to God to heal your daughter, and that very moment your daughter gets healed. My point is, I think that something does not have to be verifiable in order for it to be true. And yet, the reality of the God of the Bible is something that is presented continually as something that we can reach out and seek to verify on our own. Thanks.
Some really profound thing. I gotcha. It's an incoherent thing to ask. Asking if falsifiability is falsifiable would be kind of like asking, is harmony harmonious? Or is digestion digestible? Or is logic logical? You're moving up to another logical level and you're asking an incoherent question. Then you can say about that question, well, what about that statement? And then what about, you go on for infinity. Logically, you stop where it makes some kind of a sense. And asking the question if falsifiability is falsifiable is a non-question. It's like, it's not coherent enough where you even have an answer. So we do know, and even if you don't use that word, if I just ask you to give me an example of a statement which, if true, would prove you wrong, that's all I'm asking. Come up with a statement. There is a black polar bear. That's a statement, right? That would prove that this statement is wrong. Just come up with a statement so that we know what you're talking about. We know that you're serious about your claim, that you're willing, at least in principle, to reject that claim if evidence came along to disprove it. Atheism is exquisitely vulnerable to disconfirmation. God, if it or he exists, is not nothing. God, if he exists, is something. If it is true that nothing comes from nothing, then God can't exist. By the very logic that nothing comes from nothing, if God is not nothing, then God can't exist either. So you haven't even started to answer that question. You referred to a little bit, you didn't use the word, but the Kalam cosmological argument, where the impossibility of an infinite, previous series of infinite causes, because if there is an infinite series of causes before this event now, and you cannot traverse an infinity, you could never have got to now. So there must have been a first cause, right? That's sort of a seductive argument. You hear that a lot. From early Islamic Kalam idea of mathematics, and then from modern cosmology of the Big Bang. But if that's true, if an actual infinity cannot exist, if a real infinity cannot exist in actuality, then what about the mind of God? Doesn't God, as you say, being a personal being, have these ordered thoughts? Did God one day say, oh, look, I created a universe, now I'm going to decide to do it? There's sort of an ordered process, even in the mind of a God, where there is a preceding cause to a following event in the mind of a God. Otherwise, it's just a jumble of thoughts. It's not a logical progression within the mind of that being. If it's true that an actual infinity cannot exist in reality, then if God is actually infinite, he cannot exist either in reality. Your argument shoots itself in the foot. If your argument is valid and there had to be a first cause, then God had to have a first thought. And if God had a first thought, he's not infinite. And then he needs a cause as well. You just answered one mystery with another mystery. Now, I'm going to get to my favorite part here, and that's the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus did not happen, at least not bodily, okay? And during cross-examination, I want to ask you, what does it mean to actually have a personal power that's non-bodily? What in the heck does that mean? How can you have a power? Power is physical. Power is work over time. And that's material. Work is measured as a material thing. So how can you have a powerful being who's non-physical if power is measured in physical terms? What kind of sense does that make? Let me ask you some things about the resurrection of Jesus, according to the New Testament. What time did the women get to the tomb? Was the sun shining or was it dark? What do you think? It was both. The Gospels contradict each other. The resurrection of Jesus, by the way, is a fascinating exercise because while most stories in the Bible are given once or twice, this is given at least 5 times. And you can compare them and you can see that they don't match. They're getting their story wrong. John said it was dark, but some others say the sun was shining. Who were the women who came to the tomb? Was it 1 woman? Was it 2 women? Was it 4 women? Was it more than that? Different names are given by the different gospel writers. What was their purpose? Was it just to see the tomb, or was it to bring spices, or had the tomb already been spiced? Take your pick. These writers don't agree with each other. When the women arrived at the tomb, was the tomb open or was it closed? What do you think? Oh, well, if you read Matthew, when they got there, this tomb was closed. And then there was a great earthquake. By the way, no one else mentioned the great earthquake except Matthew. That would have been an important historical event. An earthquake big enough to tear the temple in two, to open up the graves of Jerusalem, and all these zombies walked around and went back to their houses, and then a stone rolled away. That would have been chaos. It would have been mayhem. It would have been dead bodies and fallen houses, and yet these people are strolling around like nothing happened. But when Matthew tells the story, the tomb was closed, and then it happened, and then the angel came. But in the others, the tomb had already been opened. The stories don't match in that. Who was at the tomb when they arrived? Matthew said there was 1 angel. Mark said there was 1 young man. Luke said there were 2 men. John said there were 2 angels. If you put those reports on a graph of the decades in which they were written, by the way, Mark was written around the year 70, Matthew, Luke around 80 and 85, and John sometime after the year 90, you see the growth of the legend. With Mark, you have 1 man, not even an angel. But with Matthew, you have 2 men, and then with Luke, you have 2 angels. I'm getting it wrong here. With John, you have 2 angels. You can see the growth of legend. You see the footprint of how the story exaggerates over time. Where were the messengers situated? Matthew said the angel was sitting on the stone before it was opened. Mark said it was a young man sitting inside on the right. Luke said it was 2 men standing inside. John said there were 2 angels sitting on each end of the bed. The messages that these angels gave were 4 completely different messages. In Matthew, the angel said, Jesus is not here. You're going to see him in Galilee. Go to Galilee. There you'll see him. Well, where did they first see Jesus? Where did the disciples first see Jesus? According to Matthew, it was in Galilee, which was 60 to 100 miles away. In those days, how long would it take them to get up there? Even on the fastest horse possible, it would have taken them half a day to get up there, and yet get back in time for the others to say that they saw him in Jerusalem for the first time. Now, some people say, well, these different people can describe an auto accident from different perspectives and have different contradictory, which actually proves they were not colluding with each other. But if I told you that the accident happened in Sacramento, and Russell tells you, well, the accident happened, but it happened in Modesto. Does that make sense? There's 2 different stories here. These gospel writers don't get their story straight. I have about 12 more that I could read, but I don't have much time. But I'll just say, did the women tell what happened? Contradictory. When Mary returned from the tomb, did she know Jesus had been resurrected? Contradictory. When did Mary first see Jesus? Before or after returning to the disciples? Could Jesus be touched? After the women, to whom did Jesus first appear? Contradictory stories. Where did Jesus first appear to the disciples? Did the disciples believe the 2 men on the road to Emmaus? Yes or no? What happened at that first appearance? Different stories about what happened. Did Jesus stay on earth for a while? Some say no. Some say about 8 days. Others said in Acts it was for 40 days. Where did the ascension take place? Matthew doesn't mention it. Mark said it was around Jerusalem. Luke said it was in Bethany. And Acts said it was from the Mount of Olives. And we could go on and on and on. But I think one of the most damning things about the resurrection story is this data point that Russell mentions about the appearances. Before the Easter morning, Jesus is described in kind of normal narrative terms. They see him, they hear him, they follow him, they talk to him, and that kind of stuff. Just like you would be telling a story. But after Easter morning, everything changes. And now they're talking about he appeared unto them. Suppose you asked me if Russell was home, and I said, yeah, I went to Russell's house, and when I got to his house, he appeared unto me and showed himself unto me, and then he disappeared. You know you're not talking about a real bodily resurrection. You're talking about a spook story. You're talking about the very same word appeared, opthi, from that Greek particle from the word orao, which means like a vision. The same word is used at the Transfiguration when Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to see Moses and Elijah, who appeared unto them. Does anyone think Moses and Elijah have empty tombs as well? It was obviously some kind of a spiritual thing. The earliest disciples did not believe in a bodily resurrection. The earliest accounts, especially Paul's account in 1 Corinthians, doesn't even mention an empty tomb or even a tomb at all. He said he was buried, etafi, he was put into the ground. So we see through that first century a growth from a very simple belief that, like Grandma, Jesus died and went to heaven, and we can pray that he's up in heaven now. That's probably what a lot of those followers of Jesus thought, that he had ascended spiritually to heaven. Later, that spiritual growth evolved, if we can use that word, into a bodily resurrection from people writing 60 years later, people who were probably third hand, weren't even first witnesses to the original accounts. And there's a lot more to be said about it, but the resurrection of Jesus Christ is not evidence, at least the bodily resurrection. If you believe he spiritually went up, well, that's different. But an empty tomb, the actual bodily resurrection of Jesus did not happen. And according to the Bible itself, which is already not a very reliable book, contradicting itself and coming up with the footprints of legendary embellishment, we see that it is not. It's not even a strong data point. It is no data point at all. It is an article of faith.
This is awesome. So right now we're going to take a 10-minute break. There's the bathrooms, I don't know if you know, they're right across the way here in this building. The doors are wide open if you need to go to the bathroom. There's water and snacks over here. I don't know how much is left, but yeah, we'll come back in about 10 minutes.
Hey, would you like me to start and ask you a question?
That's fine. It looks like you got one ready there.
Okay. Would you agree that there are some things that are true even though you can't verify them? And the things I have in mind are stuff about the past that we might not ever be able to prove. Stuff about things that are going on right now in parts of the universe that we just don't have the instruments to reach. And then a third example would be moral truths. We haven't really talked about morality that much tonight, but the claim that murder is wrong. I think we would both agree with that, but that's something that many people have felt you can't verify. So could you say any more about whether you always have to have verifiability in those three cases?
Well, the only thing that can be true or false is a statement, or philosophers like to say propositions, right? And in philosophy there's different types of statements. There's analytical statements, and then there's what do they call them? Synthetic statements. So like math, 2 + 2 = 4. You can in principle prove that, verify it by taking two apples and put them together and see what they count to. You can at least do that because in math these are symbols for, presumably the integers are symbols for objects. So when you talk about the past that none of us can go back to and see, you're talking about history. Historical statements are always made as probabilistic. No historical statement is ever presented as 100% or 0%. It's always a level of confidence. You look for enough data, enough artifacts, you look for enough confirming corroborative testimony, and then you raise the likelihood. But if you find contradictory testimony, you lower it. And so when historians talk about the past, they use words like probably, likely, very likely, we're pretty sure, but no one makes 100%. So those probabilistic statements based on some degree of confidence can be confirmed by the artifacts that we have from the past, confirmed or disconfirmed by testimony and evidence from the past. And so even those statements are confirmable, at least in principle.
Let me switch gears and ask a second question. You may have a question like this for me later, but would there be something that would lead you to believe in God again? Like, could you say if this happened to me, or if I saw this piece of evidence from the first century or whatever, then you would say, okay, God is real.
Yes, and again, it would be a matter of probability. It would have to cross a certain threshold. For me, I think 50% would be a good threshold, but I think in science it goes to like 90 or 95% when they say if this is true or not. But as I said earlier, atheism is exquisitely vulnerable to disconfirmation. For example, the Bible tells you, all things whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer believing, you shall receive. The Bible says that. It doesn't say maybe. It says in prayer believing. I presume you're a believing person. So if you were to ask God to tell you something, to give you a prophecy, for example, and you said, Dan, I asked God to prove, and he told me that tomorrow at 12:13 p.m. there's going to be a meteor from the south-southwest traveling in at an 87-degree angle, traveling at this velocity, going right through this building and going through that Navajo rug and ending 17 inches beneath the floor of the basement, composed of 70% iron and 3% iridium and so on. And if you were to say that, this God who knows the future, that you believe answers prayer and does tell you, ask, all things what you ask in prayer believing. If you were to tell me that and that happened, I would have to say, yep, I was wrong. Russell's right. I have some evidence that prophecy and that God said that, but the Bible means what it says. That's just one example. I could come up with hundreds of others as well. The angel thing that you were talking about, these apparitions that somebody who you didn't see and you couldn't verify, and yet you're so eager to believe the testimony of this person. If that were to happen here, if Jesus were to appear on the stage right now in front of us and we all got it on video and we all saw it and he were to speak to me in English, that could happen. He did it in the New Testament, right? He disappeared out of thin air to the men on the road to Emmaus. All sorts of things. But if God were to tell you the exact coordinates in the Holy Land where the Ark of the Covenant is buried, and we were to go there and dig it up and find it, things like that, that would change my mind. I would admit that I was wrong. So I guess I can follow up with a question for you. The same question.
Yeah, I think that religious beliefs can be given up when contrary evidence come your way. I think that's what actually happened to the initial disciples, like Paul. But in my case, I think that here's one example. I think that if you gave me certain data, I would give up belief in a bodily resurrection. The kind I'm thinking of is if you had graves from the first century and you were able to prove that this grave was from Mary and this other grave was from Jesus, and you were to do DNA sequencing on the bones of each, you were to show that they were a match, I would probably have to give up the idea that Jesus bodily rose from the dead. Now, giving up belief in God, I think, is more, you're right, it is more difficult for me to name that piece of evidence, which, if I had it, I would relinquish belief in God. I think it would, partly because I believe that belief in God is not just a matter of experience, but a matter of philosophical reasoning. I think I would have to be persuaded of certain philosophical claims in order to give up those philosophical reasons. So even if you showed me, something remarkable about the fluctuations that were going on before the Big Bang and so forth, that by itself would still not get at the heart of the idea that, well, what produced that quantum fluctuation beforehand?
So you're admitting that it's possible. Suppose it's not a question so much of an absolute either or. Suppose it's a matter of probabilities. Suppose you learn about the origin of God belief and the societal and the cultural pressures behind it, and the psychology and the physiology of the brain and how it functions, and how we are pattern generators, and we recognize, and that's why they thought there was, the God of the gap and the weather and the thorn and all that stuff. Suppose you were to think about that enough to get to above 0.5 and say, wait a minute, now I'm not so sure that my absolute belief, could that happen to you?
I suspect that it could. It's difficult, as you probably know, to forecast your own future belief states.
Well, it happened to me, so I know it can happen.
Right.
So it can, and it happened to someone else. There's another former minister out here in the crowd, right? Who also preached for many years as a believer, who gave up. not gave up, but abandoned his faith.
I think, let me ask you another question. When you're confronted with statements from the Bible about God that you find it hard to believe could be true, either because it's like a categorical statement about a promise in prayer and you test it and it doesn't deliver, or it's some sort of moral statement about God ordering this person to do this thing which we consider to be evil. Are you inclined to doubt your interpretive abilities before you doubt your how should I put this? Before you doubt your sources? Are you ever inclined to think, well, maybe I'm just not reading this text properly?
When I was a believer, I believed that God wrote his word so that everybody could read it and understand it. Everybody. You didn't have to have a PhD in ancient languages or in philosophy to get it. And even you know that all the experts, the true experts in critical Bible scholar, and even the true believing ones, even you know they all disagree with each other as well. And that there's no coherence, there's no consensus, even among them about what the proper interpretation of it is. What we do know is that the Bible was written by human beings. And we do know that human beings make mistakes. We know that. That's a fact. We see it now. We see religions being born even today. We see that Elian Gonzalez cult in Miami a few years ago that just popped up overnight. The Virgin Mary walking the streets and the dolphins and all that. We see that happening. We know there's a huge propensity within the human species to invent and believe things that are palpably untrue. We know that that is part of our species. We know that the people who wrote the Bible were human beings who had that exact same propensity. And so it's more natural, I would think, to assume that the people who wrote that book were the ones making the mistakes. Maybe they had some truth in there. But it seems much more likely that we interpret what they wrote back then. Well, were they gods when they wrote this book? They were human beings. They were doing the best they could with what they knew, and they didn't know that much. And they put it together, and I just gave you examples of how they tripped over each other's feet on the resurrection story and disagreed with each other. So at least you and I know that those people were imperfect. And so that gives us some clue when we're interpreting this. Wait a minute, we got to take some of this with a grain of salt. We do know that even John admitted. He said, he exaggerated. He's writing rhetoric. He says that many more things Jesus did could not even fill all the books in the world. Well, that's exaggeration. We know that he's exaggerating. We know that he said, blessed are you who have seen but don't believe, but those who have not seen and believe. These are written that you might believe. He admits that he's writing propaganda. He admits that. These are written so that you might believe. He's not writing narrative history there. So when you take all that together, you see their mistakes, you see what we know about human nature, you see the way the whole thing doesn't hold together. It seems much more likely to me to interpret the Bible like we would interpret any other imperfect series of writings. Oh, we have to stop?
We're going to pause this phase of the cross-examination.
Well, can I get in one more question? Is that okay with you guys? Okay, because in response to my request that you define the word spirit or an immaterial personality, you came back with these words. You said, consider that it is a personal power, non-bodily. And I want to know how that answers the question, because those two words, personal and power, the word person, as we know the word to mean, means a physical being. That's what a person is. That's what the word person. Your brain is functioning, right? Your brain's not over there functioning. Your brain is right there in that skull functioning. It's a physical thing. Synapses within, and chemicals within a physical being, depending on what kind of food and whatever drugs you might, not that you're taking drugs, but you know what I mean? It's a physical, we have no evidence at all of any kind of consciousness outside of a physical being. So you defined a spirit as a personal, and then you said power. And power, we know, is defined in material terms. Energy itself is a form of matter. So power is time, is work over time. So how does that answer the question? You're defining a spirit as a physical thing then. How do you define it if it's non-material? What is your definition of what it actually is?
The concept of a person does not presuppose the concept of a body of any sort. And the concept of power does not presuppose the concept of the physical in any way. The concept of power is just the concept of the ability to bring about some state of affairs. and the concept of a person, people debate this, but it includes consciousness, it includes self-consciousness, it includes choosing abilities. But for example, if you were to somehow wake up tomorrow and you weren't able to hear anything or see anything or feel anything, but you were vividly conscious of your own thoughts, it would be rational for you to think, well, something must have happened to all of my sensory nervous system, and I've still got my brain, thank goodness. But it would also be rational for you to think, perhaps I'm not embodied anymore.
But does that happen? Has that ever happened in the history of all of our examination? Has there ever been any evidence that scenario you described actually happens? Is it even possible?
I've actually written a little bit on this recently in cases of medically confirmed near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. And the sorts of cases that people report that are most persuasive to a fence-sitting skeptic are cases where a person reports activity that it was happening apart from where their body and brain were during phases of a hospital stay, whether it's in the adjacent room, whether it's just in a different part of the room. And those are cases people sometimes point to as illustrations of how you could have a personal reality that's not completely tethered to a functioning brain.
So we're out of time here, I think, because I could go on about that for a whole. I've done a whole debate on that, and I actually have my notes for that. But let's not lengthen the debate tonight, unless one of you wants to ask it as a question later. So, hint, hint, hint.
Hello. Oh, it's on. Okay, so if you guys have questions, this is where you do it. So, anybody want to come up? All right, there we go.
Directed to one of either or.
And? Separate questions for each? Okay,
It's feeding back, isn't it?
yeah, just feeding back a little bit. So, rather, Mr. Barker, than take your hint on near-death experiences, hint, we're going to take Dr. DiSilvestro's hint on morality that he mentioned. I would assume that you believe in objective morality, Dr. DiSilvestro, based on God. And so, assuming that and correct that if that's wrong or add a nuance, this is actually for Mr. Barker. It's often said of Christians that atheists don't have a basis for their morality. This is especially in the context of how can you complain about the morality of God if you don't have a moral foundation or a basis on which to be objectively moral. So comment on that?
So was it directed at me or you?
It's directed at you. The question is, how do you see morality? Is there objective morality or...
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll answer that. But to be clear, he actually didn't raise that tonight. It's not actually on the table, but I think it's an important question. So
Yeah.
he mentioned morality a little bit, but he didn't raise it as an argument for God, at least not in tonight's debate.
No. I was being playful with the hints.
You hear the argument that if there's moral laws, there's a moral lawgiver. That comes up in debates a lot as well. I don't speak for all atheists or all humanists or all agnostics, but I can point out that there are a number of very good naturalistic moral philosophies that don't need either a command theory or an idea that moral values are objective things. I don't think you can have an objective moral value, because a value is a functioning of a mind, right? The mind is valuing things as a function, and to be objective is to exist independently of a mind. So how can you have something that is independent of the mind that exists within the mind? I think that's an oxymoron. But in any event, however you define, and atheists disagree about the existence of objective moral values as well. And there's some good debates among atheists about that. Some think, yes, they are real things, and some don't. I happen to think they're not. I think they're labels for the way our brains are functioning. I'm more of a functionalist in that way. But I don't speak for all atheists, but I will say this. I think most of us, and I think most Christians as well, when it comes to moral decisions, we're basing our decision ultimately on the principle of harm. What's the harm of it? Harm and its avoidance is what we're talking about when we talk about morality. Harm, however you define it, is a material thing. It could be lack of clothing or shelter or food, or it could be predation, or it could be war, it could be disease, it could be natural. Harm could be a lot of different things that threaten our survival and, as Sam Harris says in his book, The Moral Landscape, our well-being as biological organisms. So for me, and I think for most humanists, and I think even for most Christians, the question comes down to what action should I take that results in the least amount of overall harm in the real world. Not what action should I take that makes my daddy feel good. What action should I take that makes the lawgiver not offend his vanity? If a kid asks daddy, why shouldn't I do that? And dad says, because I said so, and I'm your father, and you cannot offend me, or I'm going to burn you in hell forever. I mean, that's not morality. Real moral decisions are based on real consequences in the real world, and so the best way to wrestle with, and it's never perfect because we're not as informed as we need to be on every issue, but the best way to try to be a moral being is to look at your available actions, try to be as educated as you can about the real consequences of those actions in the real world, and then try to pick the path that results in the least amount of overall harm. You're never going to get to zero harm because we bump into things and we hurt, and sometimes you actually have to cause harm to minimize harm. Like everyone agrees, I think, that we should not take a needle and jam it into a baby unless that baby needs a life-saving injection. And then you will take a needle and you make the baby cry and the baby's going to hurt, but you're going to do that because your overall objective is to that compass. A compass doesn't tell you where to go, it just tells you where north is. So a moral compass doesn't tell you what to do, it just tells you your direction. And the direction, I think, is to end up in a world that has an overall minimal amount of harm in it. That's what we mean by morality. It's certainly not following commandments by a deity whose ego is so insecure that he has to wipe out whole groups of people who don't worship him on the same day that he thinks he should be worshipped. That's the command theory of a dictator, really. That's not morality. And if you surrender your mind to the commands of a dictator, you're not moral. You'll just do whatever the dictator tells you. So that's oversimplifying. I'm sorry, there's much more that can be said about it. And maybe somebody has a better naturalistic philosophy than I do, but at least the fact that there do exist natural, non-theistic, non-supernatural moral philosophies shows that we can have a moral compass to get through the world. You want to reply to that, or did you want to go?
I'm happy to add my 2 cents, but I'll get to your question because I teach a whole class on this. It lasts a semester. But my initial thing to say to your question about objective and subjective is that sometimes people mean by an objective moral law something which is there even if all human beings don't recognize it. But sometimes people mean something even stronger than that, which is something that is there even if no minds whatsoever recognize it. And I think the most sophisticated Christian views of morality are that God, in his character and his personality, is the fountain of all different moral values. So in that sense, morality does come from a mind. It's not just a cloud or a bubble that's floating out there. But human beings might not agree with that, and yet the divine mind would still be the source of morality, even if people decided, even if other people, like humans, decided to turn away from
May I
it.
follow up on that just on a real brief point?
Yeah, do you want to take the mic?
Yeah, you won't mind.
Is that okay, Nate?
She's my wife.
Well,
So he decided I wouldn't mind.
it depends
I think
on
it's
whether you're
relevant.
harming her by preempting her here.
I think what you say is really good. One of the things that happens often in debates is with the objection of the divine dictator, and Christopher Hitchens, of course, like taking that to the infinite degree, or, well, not infinite. But anyway, the criticism from Christianity is that, well, as an atheist, if God is in fact the definer of objective morality, you really have no place to make that statement because God had a reason or whatever the case may be, and we may not know any of it. My question for you that I'd really love to get an answer on is, what if there is a deistic God out there that exists that hasn't revealed him, her, or itself, and that objective law that you're speaking of is based on that designer's law, and therefore we all, Christians and atheists, have that same morality put in us by that deistic God, and the Yahweh God is the one that's made up by men, therefore the atheist can criticize that God's morality. Does that make sense? Could you respond on how like maybe a Christian would approach that?
Yeah, the idea that there could be a moral lawgiver that is not human, but divine, but not Yahweh, is a coherent position, at least just hearing it. But I think that this goes back to the argument that C.S. Lewis made in his short little tract, Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. This is the little bit that Francis Collins, the director of the Human Genome Project and now the NIH, credits with being the most persuasive argument to him for the reality of God. And Lewis, I think, there makes a good point that, you know, any God that is the source of morality would be the best claim to the real God, like the highest God. So, of course, the Christian conviction down through the centuries has been that the Creator God and the moral lawgiver God are the same God. But if you had to pick and choose which one to worship, well, that's tough. I'd say go with the moral lawgiver God. Go with the morally good God. Not just the one who's got the strength to back up the commands, but the one who has the character of love, which, by the way, goes beyond just not harming. It goes towards positively benefiting people in the ways that are maximal.
Thank you.
Let's hear from
Making sure this time. Okay, my question is for Dr. DiSilvestro. I think is it an O at the end? Okay. My understanding of the Old Testament leads me to believe that there is an Old Testament God. And my reading of the New Testament leads me to believe that there is a New Testament God. And actually it segues nicely into your last comment, because it seems that you can sort of pick and choose different gods out of Scripture, the Bible. And so my question to you is, who is God?
The God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament, not only in my own conviction, but in the conviction of countless Christians down through the centuries. Nevertheless, it was an early Christian, well, I put Christian in scare quotes, it was an early Christian experiment to separate these two. I think Marcion was one theologian who initially toyed with that, and there probably have been others who seriously considered the idea that there were two separate gods here, one a God of love, the other the God of law. The simple answer to this, I think, would be that if you look carefully at the character of the God presented in both the library of literature that we call the New Testament and that library of literature we call the Old Testament, you see some of the same kindness and tenderness and love and patience and the sort of thing that Victor Hugo writes about that Jean Valjean has towards Fatima in, Les Mis, in the Old Testament as well as the New. And you find some of the wrath and judgment and sternness and startling ferocity that is characteristic of very serious-minded God with heaven and hell in the balance in the New Testament as well as in the Old. So I don't see the dichotomy as sharply as Marcion and others do. And I think that whenever there's a tension between the two, you always have to go with whatever Jesus does as the, clearest expression of what God is like. Jesus does say the most important command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. He also says, if you've seen me, then you've seen the Father. And one example that Christians probably point to more than others is the example of the woman who's caught in the act of adultery. Everyone wants to stone her to death. And instead of stoning her to death, when he's posed with the question, what should we do? Jesus said, let you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone. Of course, that story has a happy ending. No one throws a stone. Jesus tells the woman, has no one condemned you? She says, no, sir. And he says, neither then do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin.
I think Russell makes a good point. I think the Christianity that I used to believe pretty much does integrate both of those gods as the same God. And he's also right to point out that the myth of the sweet, peaceful, loving Jesus is untrue, because he popularized hell. He talked about a place of weeping and wailing and gnashing, and he said it's better to pluck out your eye than that your whole body should burn in hell. Jesus showed us how compassionate he was by saying there are some slaves you should not beat as hard as others because they didn't know any better. Jesus recommended there should be certain men who should castrate themselves. They make eunuchs of themselves for the kingdom. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So there's a lot of brutality in the New Testament as well, although I think the Old Testament God is much more brutal. Just to list the number of pages where he commanded, committed, or condoned killing of innocent people, including little babies, not only commanding it, but saying you should be happy to do that. Psalm 137:9, happy shall be he that takes and dashes the little babies against the rocks. It doesn't say, oh, during wartime we must regretfully have to do things like that. A true Christian should be happy to take those innocent babies and dash them against the stone. So we see huge brutality and megalomania within the God of the Old Testament, calling himself jealous and a war god and intolerant and scorching the earth and all of that. And we see echoes of that in Jesus himself, who even admitted. Jesus said, in Christmas time you hear peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Jesus said, think not that I'm come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword, to separate families, to break apart families, to cause division. So he was not the sweet, nice, loving Jesus that I used to believe in, because I wanted this God boyfriend to be with me all my life. That same character pretty much is reflected in, and of course, why wouldn't it be? They were Jews, basically, who were inheriting that Jewish image of this wrathful being, from their ancestors. So, you'll find some love, but actions speak louder than words. You see all these pages of the God of the Bible doing these horrible things that we should lock him up for, certainly not worship him. Russell said earlier, you got to pick somebody to worship. Why? Why do you feel this need to worship something? Why do you want to pick something to worship, to bow down before this master, or so he won't send you to hell? But if this God did exist, if the God of the Bible truly did exist, as depicted in those pages, who created a hell, I would tell that God to go to hell. I'm better than that. You are better than that. I'm more sane. I mean, if Jesus existed in today's society, I would not want to live on the same block with such an insecure person who talks about greater than Solomon, and he had this sort of small town cult mentality when he said, "You're either for me or against me. He that is not with me is against me." That kind of attitude. But of course, that's not true. You can be neutral. But he said, "If you're not with me, you're against me." That's the kind of master-slave disciple relationship that a lot of these cults start, and that Jewish cult that started in the first century had the same thing. And so I think Russell is right to a large degree that the God of the New Testament is very much like the God, a chip off the old block, we can say.
Well, I'm going to ask about the near-death experiences. And it seems, Dr. DiSilvestro, it sounds like if you've written on it, you should know a lot about it. I kind of like to hear what both of you have to say. But the research that I've done, and it seems like the vast majority of near-death experiences were experiences or visions that were familiar with that person, whether it be Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, or even atheists who've had near-death experiences and had a vision of their close family and close friends. It seemed like they always, the vast majority had an experience that they were familiar with towards their religion or their beliefs. How do you explain that?
I'll go first on this, just by saying I'm happy to basically assume for the sake of discussion that 99% of these can be explained by your brain and your culture and their combination. The part that I think are the most philosophically interesting are those that are often called out-of-body experiences that have been corroborated by third-person testimonies. Let me tell you what I have in mind and give you 2 examples. I once had a student who said that she had a heart attack as a child, and when they rushed her body to the hospital, she floated down the street into her neighbor's house, and her consciousness was aware of the minute details of what was going on in that house, even though her body was off at the hospital. And then at one point in the process, her body was whisked back, her consciousness was whisked back into her body. And then when she recovered, she went to the house and she reported in detail what she had heard when she was floating around as a disembodied consciousness. I put that in my article. Now, that's one person's report. There's other reports that come from people in hospitals where they have similar kinds of experiences to that, where they see things from a vantage point that is not the vantage point of the set of spatial points behind their retinas or within their brain cavity. The second kind of example that I have in mind is the corroboration that happens when a person dies or thinks that they died, and they come into contact with some other dead person, like some other form of consciousness that used to be alive and is no longer. And then when the first person comes back to their body, they report, I saw so-and-so, and they told me this and that. And the people around them say, but how could you have seen so-and-so? You didn't even know they existed. They were like your grandpa who, died before you were born. Or they were your, sibling who died in the car accident 5 minutes before you did in a different part of town. So I think that those kinds of experiences, they don't get you all the way to biblical Christianity by any means, but they're illustrations of how there may be more things in heaven and on earth than we're accustomed to thinking about in our philosophy, especially if we try to reduce consciousness to a set of brain properties.
Russell is right that in the literature of near-death experience and out-of-body experiences, there are some stories that seem pretty amazing, but they are a tiny, tiny minority of the vast number of stories that people tell. For example, my former mother-in-law, Wilda, her name was Wilda Feinfrock, and she was a wonderful person. She died, and the relatives were in the room at the time, and as she was getting kind of delirious, and she was, a few minutes before she died, she was talking, she saw heaven, she saw the city of heaven and the gates, and then she saw her aunt there, and she saw me, Dan Barker. I see Dan up in heaven. He's up there welcoming me into heaven. And everybody's going, wow. Well, I wasn't anywhere in California. I was over in Indiana at the time. So I obviously wasn't dead, but she saw me that I was dead. If you take these stories of people who report seeing dead people and you put them all in a row, you are going to find a few that match, that happen to be statistically. It would be a true miracle if that never happened. There's a story about a woman, a young couple, I think they were on a date, were in a car accident, and she was knocked unconscious, and she was like near death, and she came back, and she reported that she and the young man she was with were ascending together. They were holding hands, and they were floating up into heaven together, and they saw this light, and they both felt this feeling of love, and they looked at each other, and it was just incredible. And she came back and she reported that story. The only trouble is the guy wasn't unconscious. He wasn't even near death. He wasn't even with her at the time. Her brain was building that experience. There are so many stories of near-death, out-of-body experiences that don't match the facts. They come back and report things that were actually wrong in the room. But what happens with confirmation bias, and Russell has to know this if he's read the vast amount of literature there, is that people tend to pick the ones that support the case. If you take all of them and put them all together, in fact, even who wrote, in the 70s, he wrote the big book.
Raymond Moody.
Yeah, Raymond Moody's reports this composite of a near-death experience of somebody's going through a tunnel and you see a light, and then you have a review of your life experiences, and then you'll see relatives in that, and you'll feel like you're in the presence of the creator of the universe. He admits, even in that book, in 1975, that experience actually doesn't happen to anybody. That was a composite experience. And Russell even said today, there was a Collins who said he saw a red light. Hardly anybody sees a red light. It's usually a white light if they see a light at all. Only 10 or 20% of people who are clinically dead actually come back reporting something like that. Many of them report things that they saw in the room that actually, a woman said, well, there was some mail on the table. I was out of my body and I saw some mail on the table beside my bed on this round, and it was from one of the nurse's cousins, and I saw it there. Well, it turns out there was no mail and there was no table, but the nurse had come in and was talking about her cousin, and they were talking about a Mayo, M-A-Y-O, a Mayo table that was over in another part of the room. So we know that when people are near death, the last thing to go is hearing. Hearing becomes magnified. And so she was hearing this and trying to reconstruct the scene, and she builds this out-of-body experience in her brain. As Russell admits, most of it is a reconstruction of a dying, hallucinating brain. And she reported something that actually was factually untrue. The clothing that people are wearing. They've done tests. They have put things up above level in these emergency rooms that nobody could possibly see. And they're waiting for somebody to come back and actually verify. In one case, it's a computer screen that keeps changing with patterns. And in another case, it's some images. And if there ever were a near-death out-of-body experience, if somebody above everybody could look at and see that, that would be pretty amazing. That's never happened. That test has failed. Of course, they haven't done the test as much. But usually what you hear from these, instead of Raymond Moody's scenario of, that simplistic composite that he put together that nobody actually has, he just sort of pieces them together from a number of stories, it's more likely that you would find yourself dead, stuck inside a huge calabash gourd, crawling through a hole in it, and there's a big yellow cornfield, and a blue train is coming through, and on the train, there's Jesus, except he's big and fat and he's red and he has a white beard, and he's sitting next to Pope Gregory III, and he's sitting next to Yamaraj, and the train's going through, and he's sitting next to Superman, and over here is Mario Brothers. And there's a little butterfly that comes and whispers in your ear, are you hungry? Do you want to eat? If you take the stories of people who have these experiences and you put them together, you can come up with a fantastic, obviously hallucinatory experience. In the case of the little girl, that would be pretty amazing if that could be corroborated. You know the story about the blue shoe, probably, in your literature. That has already been shown to be not true. The story of the blue shoe with, what was her name? I can't remember her name anymore, but I have it written down. They actually went back, some students went back to the hospital to check, and actually the shoe would have been visible from the room that the woman said she had died and seen the shoe. And the story wasn't even reported until 7 years later, and the woman didn't even speak English, and the nurse who said that she had this experience, if you go back and scratch beneath the surface of a lot of these stories, you find out that they really don't hold water as solid evidence. So we're waiting. I think the jury is out. I'm not saying it's impossible that out-of-body experiences happen, but from the evidence we have right now, it is so thin, it's much more likely to be either coincidence or fabrications or wishful thinking. And besides that, they weren't dead. They were near death, but they weren't dead. We don't have any experience of somebody 10 days later coming back to tell us something. It's always people who aren't really actually dead yet having, like Susan Blackmore talks in her book, I think it was Dying to Live, is that her book? You read her book, all right, where she does report that what we can most explain by medicine is that the dying brain is reaching out, it's reconstructing, it's listening, it's trying to build a picture of the world from the scattered things that it's hearing. You can hear way down the hall, you can hear things in the next room, you can come back and report what the nurses were saying in the laundry room. How could they have known that? So there's much more likely to be a naturalistic explanation for these so-called near-death experiences than that there is a God who's somehow picking this one little girl's brain to go down the street to her friend's house. I mean, what's the point of that?
I need to add one more point, and that is you don't have to choose between a God thesis and a naturalistic brain thesis, because as A.J. Ayer himself points out in his article where he talks about his near-death experience and then explains it away, he recognizes that two of the most prominent atheists of Cambridge during the period of time before Ayer went through the higher education system, two of the most prominent atheists were believers in a mind or a soul that could survive the death of the body, and yet they didn't believe in a God. So it's not a straight line from, there is the possibility of disembodied consciousness to there is a God who is a spiritual personality.
I agree with that. I think that makes sense. And if it does turn out that all of these reports are right, it doesn't point to the God of the Bible, at least.
Everywhere. But I was curious what you guys think. I see a lot of miracles and just weird things happen with people who believe in Hades, people who believe in Jesus, atheists, anybody. It seems like that they can believe hard enough they can achieve something with the power of their mind or matter. And with a lot of reports, I've seen people's skulls change and doing weird things, walking through fire and not being hurt. And I just wondering what you guys stand on that.
Why don't I go first? I think that atheists and non-Christians can have supernatural experiences just like Christians can. And they might explain them as not being supernatural, or they might explain them as, something else. But just because you're believing in God as a supernatural power, that doesn't mean you have thereby given up the ability to explain things with other supernatural powers, like demons or whatever. It's not just like God in the world of physics.
You believe in demons?
Yes. Some of the stories that I had ready to read tonight dealt with unfriendly angels.
You started off your question using the word miracle, but then you describe things that are not necessarily miracles. They're amazing things. They're extraordinary things, perhaps. We do know that walking on hot coals now can be explained naturally. In fact, there's Skeptic Society does it all the time. If you walk fast enough, the soles of your feet have some moisture on it. You know how you can put your finger through a flame if you go fast enough? You can walk on hot coals as long as you get across pretty quick. If you don't dilly-dally, it can be done. And in fact, some of these people who claimed that it was supernatural actually ended up burning their feet because they didn't quite go fast enough. So you can explain that in a natural way. That's not a miracle. That's a trick. It's pretty amazing. If you look at magic tricks, they look like they're real. The power of the mind, you're right, is amazing. I think belief in any religion can motivate people to do some pretty amazing things. They can motivate them to be more charitable. It can also motivate them to be more cruel. I think what religion does is it amplifies who you are. And you see cruel people taking the Bible and acting more cruelly. It's their human nature that's doing that. If a person thinks they're so weak that they can't fight alcoholism any other way than by believing in a higher power, then by all means find some way to be sober. Delude yourself. Think there's a God helping you. But there's a lot of people who fight it without belief in a supernatural power, and they don't even pretend it's supernatural. The existence of the supernatural still has yet to be established, and yet we're throwing that word around as if it means something. We haven't even established it or defined it. It's one of these tenets of most religions. Does Mormonism have a supernatural God? I think Mormonism has a physical being God. But in any event, it's okay to hypothesize. Sure, like we hypothesize the ether, fine. But until we actually demonstrate that there is such a thing or a place or even coherent concept of the supernatural, it is much more likely to take these stories that you're telling me and see them through a natural lens. Like the time when I was in Mexico City. In fact, I saw Gary today. Gary is an old preacher friend of mine, and he and Glenn just live right up here. I went and visited them. Gary was the bass in Mexico City back in 1969, and he had to preach that night, and he had lost his voice. He said, I can't sing tonight. I can't breathe. So we prayed before the meeting, and I laid hands on Gary's shoulder, and I said, Gary, in the name of Jesus, be healed. And Gary said, praise the Lord. And he went up and he sang and he preached. That really happened. That actually really happened. I laid hands on him and I prayed, and his voice came back, and it was, I saw a miracle, right? And you can imagine how affirming that is to your faith when you do something like that. But I used to say when I told that story that, well, okay, I can't go back and recreate that, and until we rule out all the possible natural explanations to explain what happened, it's irresponsible to just jump to a supernatural conclusion, right? Because no matter how unlikely the natural possibility is, it's much more likely than the supernatural one. But now, a couple of years ago, a woman came up to me and she said, well, do you know there is a thing when you're tired and nervous that's called a laryngeal spasm. It kind of tightens up and you can't really talk anymore, but if you can relax, if you can take some deep breaths and meditate or something like that, then you can get over that fear. You can get up and do public speaking. So when I went to Gary and I put my hand on it, and then Gary relaxed and we were praying, and that would be a pretty plausible, naturalistic explanation for what happened to Gary's voice. Have you ever noticed that you see people discarding their medicine, but you don't see they're discarding prosthetic devices or glass eyes? You don't see any real, actual, organic miracles. You see things like, oh, the pain is much better. Or we prayed for Grandma in the hospital, and Grandma didn't die for 6 more days. You know, I mean, it's always something that could have been naturally explained. So I think atheists will say there's some amazing things that happen in life. I've had some incredible things happen. I mean, you know, it's statistically improbable things, but those things do happen. I made a paper airplane in college, and just to test it, I just let go of it, and it made a complete, graceful 360-degree or more arc through my room. Wow! And then it went into the bottom drawer that was just open a slit, and it went right into that drawer. How do you explain that? I mean, even if I was trying to do that, right? So things do happen. They're pretty amazing in life. Things happen like, you know, I didn't even try. You know what I mean? I knew I could never do that again. So you've all had experiences, haven't you? Where something happens that, oh, that's pretty, is that a miracle? Or is that just unusual?
One more question?
Oh, one more.
Okay, my question was similar to the last guy's too, I guess, but so my understanding then, does atheism recognize any type of metaphysical world at all? Or spiritual world?
Depends on which atheist. Atheism is not a creed. Atheism is not a doctrine. Atheists don't have to agree with each other. But there are some atheists, for example, who think that numbers are real objects. So that might be kind of a metaphysical, Platonic concept. Some atheists, I don't think so. But atheism is just a very narrow thing. Atheism is just a description of a person who does not have theism. They don't have a belief in a God. Atheists might have all sorts of other beliefs. Atheists might be irrational. Atheists might be misinformed. Atheists might be immoral. I mean, it doesn't follow that if you're an atheist, you necessarily have this whole package metaphysical belief system. In fact, many atheists think there's room for spirituality in the world without a God. I don't. I think the word spirit is just a synonym for like emotions and aesthetics and feelings and beauty and that. You know, that when I'm playing jazz piano in a combo and I get this feeling and goosebumps and whoa, it's like an illusion of transcendence. Even though I'm not really transcending, there's this neat feeling that happens. So all of us atheists have room in our lives for things like that, for being in love, for feeling charitable and altruistic, for looking at art, for all these things that you can't reduce to a propositional statement that you test whether it's true or not. Most of our life is lived outside of that logical requirement that everything has to be rational. So I think I can answer your question by saying yes, but not in a supernatural way. There's a natural way that we can participate in what believers call spirit.
Thank you. I did have another question too.
Unless you wanted to respond to that. Okay.
My other question was, Christianity. The evidence of a historical Jesus, I guess, was my question. To me, history holds the truth, but to prove what historically happened is next to impossible. I understand that. But still, I don't see the Bible as a history book, because there's too many things that we know historically could not have happened, such as the account in the Old Testament of the sun standing still. Possible. It happened. Couldn't. But so I just don't see the Bible as a history book. So is there another account of Jesus existing other than the Bible? And one paragraph in the book of Josephus. I understand that. But other than those two accounts, is there any other historical account of Jesus existing?
You know what, I'm not the expert on extra-biblical sources for the life of Jesus, but I know that Gary Habermas, who I've mentioned twice tonight, got his PhD from the Michigan State University researching that sort of question. But I wanted to just say that some of the people who wrote stuff that now made its way into the New Testament seem to be writing stuff trying to say that what they were writing actually happened. So you get statements like, we actually were eyewitnesses of His Majesty. Or we touched with our hands and heard with our ears and saw with our eyes the sorts of things we're talking about. So at least the authors of those things, or the editors who took those writings and put them together, were wanting to allow the reader to know some of these things are being put before you as potential real stuff. That's all.
Well, there's too much to say about that question, and critics don't agree, atheists don't agree about whether Jesus existed or not as a historical person. I know Bart Ehrman is pretty sure he did exist. I think there is a probability that there was a first century self-proclaimed Jewish Messiah named Yeshua. It's possible. There were others. There was a Theudas the Christ. There was a Judas the Christ that Josephus also wrote about, who thought he was the self-proclaimed Messiah, who did miracles, and there were others like that. There was an Egyptian Jew Messiah, so there might have been a Yeshua the Christ. It wouldn't have been Jesus, because that would have been from the Greek translation of the Greek word for it. But I think the probability, and history is all probabilities, I think the probability is less than 50%. We can't rule it out. You can't say that he didn't exist. But what we can say is that New Testament Jesus, that cartoon character that was written many decades later, that caricature did not exist. The caricature that did all these miracles and said all these strange things. Maybe that story was based on an earlier thing. Maybe there was a real Paul Bunyan, a man named Paul Bunyan, but we don't think the blue ox and all that stuff really happened. It was a later legendary embellishment. And when you look at when the Gospels were written, if Jesus lived, we don't even know when he was born, because the Gospels contradict themselves about when he was born. There's a 9-year discrepancy there, and one of them has to be wrong, Luke or Matthew, or each of them is wrong. If you put those documents in history when they were written, if Jesus died, it would have been around the year 30, if he lived. The very first thing we have about the resurrection, or anything, the Paul's epistles in the year 55, a quarter of a century later, is the very first thing we have written by somebody who was not a disciple of Jesus. And Russell called Paul a disciple of Jesus. Paul never met Jesus. In all of Paul's epistles, which were written first, he never quotes Jesus. He never mentions a miracle of Jesus. In fact, he sometimes disagrees with Jesus. Paul never claimed to have known him as a human being. And then we have Mark around the year 70. Whoever wrote Mark was not a first-generation Christian. Life expectancy in the first century early Rome was about 45. So how old were those disciples when Jesus died? In their early 20s, maybe? If they were all killed in these martyr deaths that people talk about, how did any of them live long enough to write these Gospels? 40 years was the earliest Gospel. 40 years later, Mark's writing. And then 50 years and 55 years for Matthew and Luke. And to answer your question more specifically, there is nothing out of the first century. Nothing. There were people who wrote in great detail about that part of the world. Philo of Alexandria, Philo Judaeus, some people sometimes call him. Others wrote about other self-proclaimed messiahs and stuff, but there's nothing contemporary with Jesus that was written during the time when he supposedly lived, or even 60 years later. And you're right, Josephus mentions something, but most critics agree that that was tampered with, because it doesn't show up until the 4th century. That little paragraph about Jesus in the writings of Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, doesn't show up until around the year 325, at the time of Eusebius, who is known as a dishonest historian who probably stuck that in. The language is later, and he wouldn't have called Jesus the Christ, because Josephus himself was an Orthodox Jew. And so Russell even admits that early Christians in the 1st century, some of them were in the habit of tampering with the scriptures to change things, to make it look better. So as I pointed out earlier, these were human beings who had motivations and they had agendas and they tampered and they rewrote. Even Paul admits in the Bible, there were people writing false epistles. He said, you're going to get some epistles that are from me, but they're not. So saying that doesn't increase our confidence in the reliability of those books when we see all this borrowing and changing and adapting and editing and inserting and interpolating from later. It lowers the probability. It doesn't get to 0, obviously, but it lowers the probability that we're looking at truthful historical statements.
All right, if you guys want to go ahead and just take a couple minutes to just a quick closing statement. I know we've gone a little over time because everyone's kind of sleepy, but I'm kind of glad we went over time. It was kind of cool.
Well, my closing statement is thank you very much.
Thank you.
And my closing statement is, you're welcome.
All right. So yeah, I just want to. I'm extremely thankful that you guys agreed to come out and do this. I didn't know how it was going to turn out, especially when I first wrote Dan with this idea. But yeah, thank you so much to Dan Barker and Dr.